Hello and welcome to today's event, where we will be talking about how we can create a fairer property tax system. The event will include 5 questions with the panel members and the questions that they have seen in advance. Following those questions, there will be a question and answer session where you can ask the panelists any question that you have, either about what the panelists said during the event or general questions about the issues we have discussed. You can either ask a question at the end of the event, or if you can prefer, type it into the Zoom chat and I will read it out at the end. So our event today will look at property taxes within the UK. Our current system consists of council tax, which is based on the value of your property, but uses tax bands depending on the value of the property. We also have business rates, which are based on the rental value of the property and then multiplied by a rate for either small or standard size businesses. Finally, there is stamp duty, which is a tax on those buying land or property. In Wales, there is a similar system called the land transaction tax. To replace these existing taxes, 2 taxes have been proposed. A proportional property tax, which is a flat rate on the value of the property, and a land value tax, which is a flat rate on the value of the land. So to discuss this topic, we are joined by a wonderful array of guests from across the political spectrum and from across the UK. They include Peter Fox, MS, who is the Shadow Minister for Finance in the Senedd, Tom Spencer from London New Liberals, Shreya Nanda of the IPPR's Centre for Economic Justice, Andrew Dixon, the founder of Fairer Share, Torrin Wilkins, the Director of Sinter, and Jasneet Samrai, the Deputy Director of Centre. So let's begin with the first question, and this will firstly go to Peter. Do you think it would create a fairer tax system if we replaced council tax with a proportional property tax or a land value tax? So Peter, what do you think?
Sorry about that. I didn't unmute myself. I'm so used to other people doing it for me. And it's great to join you this morning, Will. Yeah, this is a thorny subject, isn't it? Something that a lot of people want to wrestle with, but often frightened to wrestle with, I think. And but on a basic level, I think we would all agree that council tax on the whole is not a good tax. Not only is it regressive, it does have a massively disproportionate impact on those on lower incomes who may, now happen to live in higher value properties. In essence, it has a particularly negative effect on people who can be described as cash poor and asset rich. And I say that because a county like Monmouthshire, where I am, there's a lot of big houses, but a lot of poor people living in them. So, how do you deal with that? Current council bandings have also been called out of date, even though in Wales council tax bandings were reviewed, haven't been reviewed since 2003, but obviously that is a far better position than in England and Scotland, where I don't think they've been done since 1991. But even what we've got in Wales has created unfairness between households in area, as well as between different local authorities. So the question then is, do we try to reform council to make it fairer, or do we replace it with something else? The Welsh Government is currently looking at revaluing the council tax bands to bring them into line with current house prices. But the last time that was done in 2003, 1 in 3 families were hampered by higher council taxes. So it's very, it's a difficult thing to do. And the Welsh Government are currently asking the IFS to do some modelling on different models of banding and to try and level some of that out. I know there have been calls for the proportional property tax charged at a fixed flat percentage of property value. And I see some real potential for that. That higher rate for empty and second homes to look at that. But I think there needs to be further exploration of that in a Wales context, because a lot of that work's been done in other places. So, but I think, again, though, with the proportional property tax, there are also risks with the approach. It doesn't fully negate the fact that some people may live in higher valued properties, but their income is not at a comparable level. So there are also some questions of how might it affect the impact on council finances? So so there would have to be some sort of redistribution I'll say it in a minute, redistribution by Wales government to make up for the shortfalls in funding. So I would argue that whilst in Wales they're currently wanting to look at council tax reform, there are two elements of funding councils. That's council tax, obviously collection, but also then the block grant and how it's distributed. And you can't really, in my view, do one without the other, because there needs to be some balancing of that to counter the consequences of any council tax reform. As I said, you know, Wales government are looking at the IFS to do some modelling, but you know, I'm looking at a bit parochial perhaps in my own area. You know, all of those models show that a place like Monmouthshire, rural, seen as affluent, even though incomes aren't necessarily the case, seeing council tax increases or the equivalent going up by 20%. You know, that is absolutely huge expectation on people. So, you know, it is a very, it's a dangerous path to walk along. As a party, as a Conservative party in Wales, we've not taken a view on what reforms should necessarily take forward at the moment. But from my personal perspective, you'll get a flavour of it that any future scheme should be made fairer. It has to be based on an individual's ability to pay rather than what they own. I know that's a difficult challenge, but you shouldn't penalise people because that's happened and they happen to live in something they may have inherited, but they can't afford probably to run. So there's some challenges there. So although reforms need to challenge, the options available to policymakers and decision makers are, you know, carry risks, and there needs to be a huge amount of modelling to be done. And I know there's a lot of work going on in that regard, so that, you know, we can make sure we make the right decisions, because there can be terrible consequences as a result of getting it wrong, like the poll tax and different things we've seen in the past. I mean, from initial perspective within Wales at the moment, and because of the situation that all people are facing across the country, governments need to do something to alleviate some of those initial problems right now. And I think, you know, to help local authorities at least freeze council tax for a little period to help people get on with their lives and get back to their lives would be an important step. But that doesn't answer your bigger question. So, you know, whilst we haven't got a position yet, I'm really anxious that what comes forward, you know, has to recognise people's ability to pay.
Absolutely, and I think it's very important, as you raise there, the point of wanting to help people who will be most hit by it, particularly in areas where people might think that, you know, there might not be individuals who would necessarily be hit by it as much, such as Monmouthshire, where there is a perception perhaps of higher income without thinking of people who, of course, on lower incomes. The same question to you, Tom. Do you think it would create a fairer tax system if we replaced council tax with a proportional property tax or a land value tax?
Firstly, I would say I completely agree with everything that the last speaker said, in that council tax is a horrifically unfair and regressive system, because we haven't revalued property prices in the last 30 years. At 1991, actually, it's made it so that the areas with the most house price growth are still valued as if they've never had that growth. So people have benefited absolutely loads, but the council tax simply isn't reflecting this. And when you have whole areas which had this massive house price growth, such as London and the South East, it means relatively they're not really paying that much of council tax. If you look at a place like Wandsworth, I think they only pay about £750, £800 a year in council tax. If you could compare that to Hartlepool or Middlesbrough, they're paying more than double that. And I would say, compared to the last speaker, I'm probably a bit more optimistic about the success that the proportional property tax will have. So although any change will always have winners and losers, the reason that is there have been people who benefited unfairly under the current system. So and I think what the proportional property tax does, as Fairer Share have advocated so with their model, is it mitigates a lot of the harm that the losers would have. So for example, any of the increases in tax will be capped at £1,200. If you are not in a position to pay it immediately, you can defer payment until you're able to downgrade your house into something you can afford a lot better. And also, it kind of ignores that the vast majority of people will be winners from this change. So I think something like 78% of people will end up with a net saving from the imposition of a proportional property tax. So I'm completely sure that this would be a much fairer system than what we have at the moment.
Absolutely, and I think you raised some particularly pertinent and interesting points there, Tom, about the way in which taxation is viewed and the way that it is implemented are often, in some ways, somewhat different across the board and afflict people more in particular areas than other. Shreya, if I could turn to you, do you think it would create a fairer tax system if we replaced council tax with a proportional property tax or a land value tax?
Yes, I don't want to obviously repeat the great points that the last two speakers have made, but I think, you know, it's hard to imagine a property tax reform that wouldn't lead to a fairer system than the one we have now, just because council tax is so far from the kind of property tax system that we want to see. I think to understand this, we have to look back at the history of the housing market over the last 40 to 50 years. You know, as we all know, house prices have gone up massively all around the country, but especially in places like London and the southeast, like, you know, cities where there's been huge growth in the economy and jobs. And like, in my opinion, a fair tax system would look at that and then say, okay, like, how do we make sure that everyone can benefit from these opportunities? You know, how can we make sure that the existing housing stock is shared fairly, or how can we make sure that enough housing is built for everyone? But unfortunately, we've not done either of those things. Instead, huge house price gains have been accrued by the lucky people who owned houses in those places over those decades, and the rest of society have, to a large extent, been locked out from that growth. So reforms to our property tax system, so moving away from council tax, which is, you know, not that different depending on how much your house is worth, to a system where you pay more if your house is worth a lot or if it's gone up a lot in value. That would be enormously helpful for wealth inequality, you know, because then the people with most housing wealth would pay the most, in terms of intergenerational inequality, because at the moment, a lot of those gains have gone to older homeowners who were lucky enough to buy at a time when housing was a lot cheaper, and instead housing and those gains would be shared more fairly across the generations. And in terms of regional inequality, because as Tom and Peter have said, at the moment, council tax bills are quite similar around the country, whereas if we had a property tax system that was based on house prices, you'd see people in the highest price areas paying a lot more.
Absolutely, and I think you're completely right to hit on the fact that there are certain sections of the population that have been essentially priced out of the market and are unable to get on the housing ladder. And of course, one of those sections of society that is most often talked about in terms of not being able to get on the housing ladder are young people. Now, how do you think we can best use the tax system to help young people when buying a house or renting a house? So, Jazz, if you could start, what would your response to that question be?
Hi, so like Peter, I currently live in Wales. I study at Aberystwyth. And whilst I've been here, it's very much been my home. I've started to learn the Welsh language. I have a job in town, and I pretty much fallen in love with Wales and kind of want to stay here for the rest of my life. So yeah, but I know that this is something I'm not going to be able to do even if I wanted to, especially in Aberystwyth. Like Shreya spoke about, there's high house prices here and high rents. So it's something that's just very out of reach for me, because the area is one of the parts of the country that's in very high demand. So for me, reforming taxes is not just about increasing the number of housing available, but also making houses much more affordable. It's also about being able for people to live where they want to live and to contribute to communities that they want to be part of. So I think one of the reasons that the housing crisis is so hard on young people is not only that houses aren't available, but also that they don't have a choice over where they live. And I think that there are lots of solutions for this issue. I don't think there's one magic, you know, policy that can be passed to fix everything. But I do think there are small steps that we can take both through the Senedd and within the UK government to make the situation better. For example, in Wales, we don't have stamp duty, but we have the land transaction tax. So one thing that the Senedd possibly could do is to merge council tax and the land transaction tax into one tax, to make like a flat tax, a form of proportional property tax. So I think this idea is something that needs serious consideration by the Welsh Government. Like Peter, I think that there is a case of proportional property tax in Wales. There needs to be a lot more research on it. But I do think, especially in Aberystwyth, that it would bring so many benefits to local communities and businesses here, because it would keep, for example, students in Wales and contributing to the economy, helping Wales to progress in the future. So there's also lots of ways in which it would help. It would help reduce, for example, the amount of money that graduates had to pay on their bills, which meant that they could put money elsewhere. For example, one major problem here in Aberystwyth is that there's a lack of jobs, so lots of students are in their overdraft. So when we're talking, saving hundreds of pounds a year, that's money that could be used to save on overdraft payments. As well as that, graduates are often on a low salary, so it would help them maybe help ends meet and have a bit of extra money to spend, again, contributing to the economy. So there's a lot of benefits that can come with fairer tax reforms, and also perhaps a property tax. So there we go. Sorry about that.
No, I think you've hit on some really important issues there, Jazz, and I think that it is something that obviously is one of the great issues for young people, is not being able to live in the part of the world that they would prefer to, in which they have connections or roots there, often because of the tax system related to property. Tom, the same question to you. How do you think we can best use the tax system to help those young people who want to buy a house or want to rent a house, so it doesn't stop them from getting onto the property ladder? Oh, Tom, you're still muted.
Apologies for that. I was saying that I think the most important thing the tax system can do is stop making it a lot harder. So currently, stamp duty, as well as the transaction tax in Wales, acts as a massive disincentive from people buying new homes. So although this only begins at, I believe, in England, £500,000, what the effect of this is that when people want to move up the housing market, once they are already homeowners, so when they're in those starter houses, is a lot harder for them to do so. And what that means is that the available supply at the bottom never really frees up, because people, even if they do get into their first home, find it very, very difficult to move from that to the next one. And simply because we're not building enough houses, we have to rely on what the available stock is now. But because the available stock isn't moving fast enough, we're left in a situation where simply there's no available supply. And that is actually made worse because for those people who may live in, say, a 5-bedroom house when they have children, their children have now grown up, they don't live there. It's no longer really necessary for them to have a 5-bedroom house. I'm not supposed to be confiscated or anything like that. That would be stupid. But there should be. But currently, there are major barriers in place for them to downsize to a more appropriate house for their needs. Because if they're going to sell their house, they have to pay tens of thousands of pounds in stamp duty. And then when you look at it, is there really much point if they're having such a large cost to downsize, and the available money which they will have from doing this will be a lot less? So what stamp duty does, it just means there's no movement in the property market. People can't move up, people can't move down. There's no space for people to move up. So that would be the most important thing. But there are also things which the tax system can do to incentivize more housing actually being built. So for example, at the moment, there's very little incentive for people to actually build more dense homes. If you own massive amount of land, say agricultural land, you don't pay any business tax on that. There's no real tax of what your land is. You could just leave it there and let it accrue value, and as housing supply becomes more scarce, it will become more and more important. I think what the tax system could do to help fix that is by imposing some sort of property tax, or even better, a land value tax, to make sure that that incentive, so that people use the land they own as productively as possible. And then that would normally mean, because we have such a scarce housing market, building more housing. And as we all know, the only way we're going to get out of the housing crisis we have now is to build more. And I think that's a little imposition which could make quite a lot of difference in making housing markets a lot more affordable for young people.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that is really important. We'll touch upon again in a minute about how land is used and also ownership of it in order to accrue value. But I'm just turning to you now, Shreya. What do you think can be done in terms of the taxation system to help younger people get on to the property ladder, either through owning a home or renting a home?
Yeah, completely agree with the changes that Tom and Jasneet already talked about. So reforming stamp duty and taxing commission land, but also I think just any move to a system which better taxes the value of houses or accrued gains on housing would be a big improvement for young people. So obviously we've looked at a proportional property tax specifically. We saw that you'd see modest house price falls in some of the highest value parts of the country, but also more importantly, as a report from WPI showed last year, we'd expect a move to a proportional property tax to free up empty or underoccupied housing across the country at the moment. So up to 600,000 new homes could be freed up, and that would mean that sort of more space for young people either to buy or to have when renting. You know, we know at the moment that over half of the houses occupied by homeowners are underoccupied, and there's big differences in the amount of housing space available, both when you compare homeowners to renters and also when you compare older people to younger people. So a move to a more proportional property tax system would be about evening that out and making the system better for young people.
Absolutely. And I think one of the great issues that often affects younger people being able to buy in areas that they have grown up and lived in is, of course, second homes. And it's an issue that has been particularly relevant in the last few years, as people haven't been able to live in the places that they've grown up because other people have been buying second homes, their holiday homes. So on this point of second homes, should we use the property tax system to discourage people from owning them? Torrin, if you could start with that.
I mean, I would say the simple answer is yes. I do think that we should start using the tax system effectively to encourage people to basically move out of, if they do have a second home that they live in for part of the year, to move out of it, or if they don't live in it at all, effectively to sell the property, because of course it's not really getting lived in use, it's sort of getting asset use effectively. I think that the slightly longer answer to it is, of course, you know, as someone you know, who isn't exactly that old, I'm looking at the property ladder, and I genuinely think sort of affording my first home is such a sort of, it's such a distant goal for me. It's such a difficult one in terms of getting there. So, you know, it's a difficult situation when you're looking between that and someone who owns 2, 3, 4, 5 homes. They're completely different sort of situations. And in general, I'm sort of not opposed to people having large amounts of one thing. But I think in this situation where, you know, there's a limited supply and there is a limited amount of space available, where homes, you know, new homes can actually be built. Effectively, we do have a real problem: limited supply, limited sort of ability to build homes, and getting residents on site and everything takes so much. So I do think part of this is that difficult situation that younger people find them in, with the economy as it is, with high house prices, which makes it really unaffordable for anyone who wants to get onto the property ladder. With COVID-19 hitting everything, it's genuinely a very difficult situation to be able to get onto the housing ladder. And so in that sense, you know, the issue is kind of massive. I think there's a National Housing Federation that said it was about 8 million people had some kind of housing need. So again, the issue itself is enormous, and I don't think there's ever going to be sort of one singular solution to the problem. But I do think that things like taxing second homes to free up more houses, and then abolishing stamp duty, which actually helps people move into those new homes who are on lower wages, put those together, and I think that starts to ease the crisis. And it starts to use the housing stocks that we currently have far better than we would do otherwise. So I do think that's a way forwards. It's definitely not a sort of replacement for just building new houses, but I think alongside it'll help to ease some of that pressure. And it also will help to ease the pressure on a lot of local communities. I mean, places like Cornwall, they have effectively found themselves with areas where people just aren't living in that area during the whole of the year. They're only living in it during sort of the summer season and then are going away. And you effectively have areas that are really struggling in terms of their local community just because of how few people they have. So yeah, overall, I would say it is probably a good idea in terms of taxing second homes and hopefully using that money either to build new houses or hopefully to encourage people to move out.
Absolutely. And I think, as you say, it is an issue that is affecting some areas more than others. And I know that Wales is one of the nations that is particularly suffering from this. So Peter, turning to you, do you think we should use a property tax system to discourage people from owning second homes? Oh, Peter, you're muted.
I say it's a difficult one. I absolutely see the dilemma Torrin shared, and I've got children who are wanting to buy their own home, and they can't make that step. And what is really important to me is that local people should be able to live in local communities, get a good job, get a good house, so you don't actually erode the fabric of your community, which sadly we're seeing in a constituency like mine, where you get an elderly population, inflating house prices, and our young people have to leave and go to the cheaper areas. However, we shouldn't punish aspiration as well. So if people, desire a second home, we've got to be careful about controlling what people can and can't do. And there's a short-term issue which has been well described, and I think that does require challenging or taxing second homes. I can see that can be needed, especially in places like Ceredigion in Wales. That's a really real challenge to people, and that's come to light as well through the pandemic. I mean, local authorities already have the power to do this, and some are doing it. For instance, in Gwynedd, in North Wales, they're thinking of putting up quite a lot of increases on council tax on second homes. But you see, it's a bit of a dilemma, because you see those areas also depend on second home owners in a lot of cases, because they underpin the economy in those areas. But too often, the conversation's getting into a position where second owners are becoming demonised. And actually what we should be doing is finding ways to work with them and private landlords to open up their premises in shorter, even if it's short term, to enable us to deal with that problem. However, the longer term solution is the need for more affordable housing for people to live in their communities. We did this many centuries or decades ago when we created council housing stocks in virtually every village. There was a plan of bringing housing on. There were people could move it forward. Now people say, well, Peter, you're a hypocrite because your party decided to give the right to buy, but that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't carry on building and creating opportunity for people. There needs to be a longer term way forward. And I agree with Torrin, though, that any benefits from taxing second homes should be redirected into creating further homes for the future. So we can't just tax people and try to sort of push them away. The reality is, I don't think putting up a tax by 100% on somebody who owns a second home is actually going to force them to sell that home and put it back in the market. So we've got to work a lot closer with those individuals to find ways to sensitize them, to help us deal with the problems we get in our communities. This is a long-term situation which we're not going to deal with just a short-term fix, even though that short-term fix might alleviate some of the problem right now.
So Andrew, turning to you, the same question. Do you think that this is an issue that can be resolved through the property tax system? Do you think we can discourage people from owning second homes through the property tax system or not?
Yeah, lots of great questions, and thank you to Centre for organising today's really interesting discussion. Just by way of background, my name's Andrew Dixon. I'm founder of Fairer Share, which is the campaign to introduce a PPT and replace stamp duty and council tax. I think, you know, as Tom had mentioned, stamp duty definitely hinders mobility, and as Peter mentioned, council tax is incredibly regressive. And, you know, we're really grateful for the support that we have from a number of Conservative MPs, Labour MPs, very much cross-party campaign. And I think, you know, I'm super excited about the need for reform, but I am going to get to your question in a second, but I think it'd be interesting at some point if we can talk about the politics of reform, because I think we're perhaps aligned in many ways on the different approaches, you know, one could take, but the politics are really tricky. So to answer your question, I mean, I think there's something like 270,000 empty homes in the UK. I think there's 25,000 empty homes in Wales. I agree with Peter. I don't think there's necessarily the need to discourage people from owning it. You know, we are a liberal democracy where people have the opportunity to do as they please if they have the financial resource to do so. But I think what appeals to me is providing local communities with the funding needed to invest in their local community, whether it's schooling, whether it's transport, whether infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So I am a passionate believer that if we have a roughly 0.5% property tax for principal homeowners, I would have double that rate for second homeowners. So it'd be roughly 1% of the property value. Now, for some people, yes, that might nudge them to sell their property or perhaps pick a smaller house or, you know, what have you. But I do think, for example, if you're fortunate enough to live in a, you know, nice house, you know, in Tenby or in you know, in Cornwall, St Ives, for example, and it costs £500,000, I'd see no qualms with taxing those owners roughly £5,000 a year in council tax, and the funds can be used for the local community and the resources that they need. So I don't necessarily wouldn't outlaw it, but I would definitely be encouraging and using the tax system for those fortunate enough to own second homes and empty homes, at least for them to pay their fair share. And I think the same applies for foreign owned homes as well. And in fact, Tom Spencer wrote an excellent piece recently discussing this in the media around foreign owned homes and the importance of ensuring that they're appropriately taxed. So I think, yes, I wouldn't outlaw it. I wouldn't necessarily discourage, but I would definitely be using tax to ensure that communities are appropriately funded.
Yes, and I think it's a very interesting point that you also make on foreign-owned homes. It's not something that we may get to in the question and answer session, but it's a very interesting issue relating to property ownership in the UK. I'd like now to turn to a policy proposed by the Labour Party, which is the abolishment, the repealing of business rates for them to be replaced by something else. So do we think that we should replace business rates, or should we keep the current system? Shreya, if you could start.
Yeah, sure. So at IPPR, we've previously called for business rates to be replaced and gotten rid of and replaced with a land value tax. So business rates at the moment are a tax on the value of the whole property, so the land and the buildings, whereas the land value tax is just a tax on the value of the land. So, and what that means is that if a business invests money in doing up their building and making it really great, then they won't pay a penalty for that in the tax system. So it's a more like investment friendly, growth friendly tax. So that's one of the reasons why we've advocated for it. Additionally, it would discourage sort of speculation on land values, so people holding land free and waiting for the prices to go up, and yeah, just more generally it would encourage more building and investment in a building. It also has implications for regional inequality, so moving from business rates to a land value tax would mean lower tax bills in parts of the country where land values aren't so high, and higher tax bills in places like London where they are very high. So yeah, those are the reasons why we support that kind of reform. And then just in terms of how that might happen, the people who've looked into this have said that to make it revenue neutral, it would need to be around 4%. And we've recommended that it should be moved to sort of incrementally every year.
Absolutely. Andrew, what are your thoughts? Do you think that business rates should be replaced? And if so, what do you think should replace them?
Yeah, my day job, I used to be in banking. I'm a venture capitalist. I invest in early stage businesses, and I find business rates an abominable tax. I think it's definitely against enterprise. So many of the young entrepreneurs who I set up a business with, I'm going through their forecasts for the year, and I'm saying, I look at the business rates and I think, well, that's such an unappealing, you haven't got any assets, you haven't got any revenue, you're trying to grow a business and you pay a real deadweight tax like business rates. I think is shocking. So absolutely, I think it needs to go. I happen to be a Henry Georgist. I believe in land value tax. Very, very straightforward in my opinion. I would do an LVT for business rates. In fact, we did a paper 3 or 4 years ago called the Commercial Landowner Levy, which was the stepping stone to our work before we sort of took on residential. So yeah, listen, I am an LVT. I think it would resolve a lot of the issues, not all, but it would certainly go a long way. And there's only a certain amount of land in this country. Not all of it is productively used. We often find cases where businesses actually invest in their property and they end up increasing their tax bills. It makes no sense. I'm encouraged by the noises that I hear. Sadly, with all due respect to others on the call today, I do not think the Conservative Party will be up for an LVT, although it is supported by certain libertarian principles. I think that the Labour Party, is sending noises that this could be something they will entertain. I think Rachel Reeves talked about the inequities of business rates a couple of weeks ago, and that gets me excited. What doesn't get me so excited is I haven't heard any solutions. I think we've all talked about doing away with business rates, but actually we haven't had any solutions, and I would be encouraging the Labour front bench to talk to the likes of the IPPR and other great thought leaders in this space to make sure that we can bring around the changes that we need. So yeah, I think I'm perhaps, I get a bit annoyed, if I'm honest. I don't mean to get a bit emotional about this, Will, but I think it's an absolutely shocking tax for entrepreneurs. And if we've got young students on the call today, when they're going up to set up their business and they're thinking, well, I'd love to spend a bit of money on R&D or on production or hiring new staff. And it's like, oh, sorry, mate, you've got to give it to the HMRC and business rates. I just don't get it. But anyway, I better calm down.
It's great to hear for someone who is also an enthusiast of Henry George, someone who I've always found to be a particular interesting political thinker, and someone who's also been perhaps overlooked sometimes in political discussions. Tom, if I could turn to you, what are your thoughts on business rates? Do you think that they should be replaced, or do you think we should keep the current system?
Well, I too would call myself a Georgist, so I'm going to completely agree with everything Andrew and Shreya have just said. I think another problem which business rates have is that they discriminate massively against what nature of business you have. So for example, if you have an online only enterprise and you don't really pay much sort of rent for your building, you're going to end up paying a lot less than a typical sort of high street shop. So although that's not the prime cause of why we've seen a decline of the high street, which I would put on to increase competition from online companies, it certainly has enhanced it and made it quite a lot worse of a problem. I'd also say it's a very, very badly designed tax, even if you ignore the fundamental problem, which Andrew and Shreya have explained very well. So for example, its base is so narrow. So you would expect a very efficient tax should not really discriminate between different types of economic activity. So that leads sort of market forces to lead to the most efficient outcome. But the problem with business rates in many, many things you don't have to pay it for. So for example, if you own masses and massive of agricultural land, that doesn't have to pay any at all. And I don't really see a reason why someone who owns a little cafe or a shop should have to pay this tax when those who own massive and massive of land, which could be used for much more productive reasons, don't. And finally, I think the government made a massive mistake during COVID, because whilst they did try to sort of protect people, many people were stuck paying business rates for offices which they wanted to keep the lease, but they simply weren't using. Their with no sort of council need for that money to be taken. The government could have stepped in and provided the funds. The funds were available if they wanted to. But so many businesses across the country were struggling massively and simply being left out of the support which the government were offering, because there were just no relaxation. One's tax should reflect what one's gained at some point, and when you're not using these offices because you're in lockdown, it's such a huge cost which people simply shouldn't have to pay. And I just completely agree with everything Shreya and Andrew say. This is an appalling tax, and the devil will be in the detail of what Labour proposed to convert it to, but there's very few things which could be worse. And if you look at their 2017 supposed garden tax proposal, as well as Rachel Reeves' comments on land value tax, I'm quite hopeful that we might see quite a good proposal coming out from the Labour Party. So just hopefully they'll listen to IPPR and introduce some good policies.
I'd like now to move on to our final set question before we get into the question and answer session. There is a question in between, but our sort of final set question, which is on stamp duty. Now, stamp duty is a tax on the purchase of land or property. And in Wales, there is a slightly different system, which is called the land transaction tax. So should we replace either of those taxes? Peter, if we could start with you to begin with.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Yeah, I know there've been calls from a Fairer Share campaign for the proportional property tax to also replace stamp duty or what we've got land transaction tax, as well as council tax. And I think there is some merits in there, but there are arguments that we do recognise, and that the stamp duty does create inefficiencies in the house market. The potential impact of the removal of stamp duty land transaction tax, I think, was seen a little bit through the COVID-19 pandemic, wouldn't it, through the introduction of stamp duty holiday. So, however, the stamp duty holiday shows that we need to be careful when designing a replacement, because there may be unintended consequences of the removal of stamp duty or land transaction tax. I mean, we saw prices go up on housing, certainly in Wales, and that shot off, and that in turn can then disadvantage the young buyer who wants to come into the housing market. And so we've got to be very careful about how we alter or reform the stamp duty tax. I mean, from the Welsh Conservatives' position, we agree with a lot of the arguments. However, stamp duty and land transaction tax is again, I believe, a tax on aspiration. In the 2021 election, what we were proposing was to cut land transaction tax, scrapping it for first-time buyers, and raising the threshold to £250,000 to help more families, get onto that housing ladder, to move the market. We also called for a package of policies to boost housing building across the country, ensuring that there is an increase in good quality homes for purchase and social housing. So there is, is a big dilemma again. And whilst holidays were really helpful and did get things moving, and we didn't see the huge fall in house prices through the pandemic as a result of that, we saw it move on off. And I think probably across Wales, across the UK, there was probably 100, did I read a stat somewhere, but it might be one of yours, Andrew, is about 100,000 additional transactions made through the pandemic, which was great, but it also shoved the prices up. So better to find ways to incentivize the market, or rather help young people get onto the housing ladder. So not a very clear answer really, but we just have to be careful how we design. If we remove it, we've got to be careful of the consequences, especially for young first-time buyers.
Andrew, moving on to you, what do you think in relation to this question? Should we get rid of stamp value tax and land transaction tax, or what should we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Peter said, our campaign is very much around doing away with council tax and stamp duty. And I agree with Peter. I think that land transaction tax, stamp duty is a tax on aspiration. What we've done is we've budgeted our campaign to be revenue neutral. So the future revenue from a PPT offsets the amount of revenue currently received through council tax and stamp duty, land transaction tax. I think the bit that drives me forward is, Peter alluded to it just now, kids, right? How the younger generation get on the property ladder? And I don't think the issue is just around first-time buyers. I think it's as they move up the property ladder. And I think I'm in my 50s, I'm not living in the house now that I bought when I was 25. And you move up the ladder. And the problem with stamp duty is it hinders mobility. It hinders people's ability to move up the property ladder, not just get onto it. So our belief very strongly is that tax should be, if we're going to tax property and land, which we should, absolutely we should, it should be over the duration of the ownership of the property, not just at the beginning when you pay stamp duty, and not at the end if you might introduce a capital gains tax, which I've heard mooted. So for young families, I think it's not just about doing away with it at the beginning, but it's at all stages. So I'm a big believer in paying the tax over the duration of ownership. And give you an example, my parents, very ad hoc, anecdotal. My parents live in Cheam village in sort of southwest London, great suburbs, great access to trains, commutes, schools. They're in their 80s. They don't need access to any of that, but there's no need, and they've got 4 bedrooms. So there's absolutely 3 are empty, right? So they've got a huge amount of space that they do not need in an ideal spot for young people to move into, but there's no incentive, because if they were to move, they'd have to pay 1 to 2 years of their living expenses in tax just to downsize. It's absolutely absurd. We briefed, just for Peter's note, we briefed Sam Rowlands, who I think in North Wales. We've also briefed Rebecca Evans, who's the Minister for Finance and Local Government, on the Labour side. And I think, yes, there's a definite sort of desire and interest, and it's great, obviously, that they're working with other organisations. But I do think that things are ripe for change. Just to give you the heads up, our figures on that, so our research to date has been focused on England. We're going to have the Wales numbers priced at the end of February, so we can see what it looks like if we can do away with land transaction tax, do away with council tax, instead have a PPT, and obviously have our second homes tax, because 25,000 empty homes in Wales, I think, is completely unacceptable. I don't mind they're there, but if they're there, they've got to pay a fair amount of tax, or at least their fair share. So in a nutshell, Will, I think it's got to go. I find it absurd tax. I don't, listen, there's so much research out there. You can just Google it and you can see the absurdities, and we saw the benefits of removing stamp duty during the pandemic. So why the Chancellor has not taken this more seriously, I do not know. But anyway, sorry, I'm getting a bit worked up again. Sorry.
No, it's perfectly fine. It's better to show a bit of passion than to not show any at all. Shreya, if I could turn to you to answer this final question. Do you think that we should get rid of stamp duty tax and land transaction tax?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the points that have just been made. I think, it'd be difficult to find a policy that economists dislike more than stamp duty. It's a tax on transactions. It discourages people from making trades which would benefit both of them. Like Andrew has said, it discourages older people in large houses from moving down into smaller houses and freeing up housing stock that's desperately needed by people living in cramped accommodation, young people who want to start a family. So yeah, it's really bad in that sense. And then also it sort of just depresses economic growth. So we looked at this in a report we did recently. We estimated that you could see up to an additional £3.3 billion a year of economic activity just from the sort of the additional transactions you'd expect to see in the activities around that. And then just in terms of Peter's point on the risks of seeing house prices go up if we get rid of stamp duty, I mean, I completely agree, but I think it would be very, the proportional property tax campaign is advocating getting rid of stamp duty, but at the same time reforming council tax and replacing it with a proportional property tax, which could very easily go the other way and see house prices go down if people are now paying higher tax bills. So I think it's very easy to design the policy in such a way where you wouldn't see prices go up when you got rid of stamp duty, and you'd make the housing market a lot easier for young people to enter. So I don't see that as a concern.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for answering all the questions that have been sent to you. In a moment, we'll be getting on to the Q&A, but I do have one final question. And my final question to everyone here is, we've obviously been discussing housing and, you know, of course, a part of that is living in properties and enjoying the surroundings of those properties as well. So if we were able to live in any historic house anywhere in the world for a month, which historic house would we choose to live in for a month? Anyone can start, but I know that Torrin is very keen to answer this question, so I'll go to him first.
It's a difficult, so just to give some context here, every time that Will ends a podcast or an event, he will always ask a slightly different question. It's a really, really tricky one. I mean, I would say, I'm going to go for probably the Versailles Palace. There you go. Because I don't know. I mean, I visited once, and I would say, you know, if there's anywhere in history, it's not quite a house, but I would say there's anywhere in history, you know, that during the French Revolution, then that would be certainly interesting.
I think that's a great answer. Andrew, what about you? Any historic house that you could live in for a month?
Well, I think given the shenanigans, there's only one place I'd like to have a quiet look and see what's actually going on, and that would be 10 Downing Street. I think would be absolutely fascinating right now.
I think that's a great answer. Jazz, what about you?
I don't know. I'm not gonna lie. I've just Googled famous houses and trying to find one that appeals. Who knows? Yeah.
I mean, I think Versailles is a good bet. I think Versailles would certainly be a good bet. Peter, what about you? Any historic house that you could live in for a month?
I've had a look in number 10, so I won't go back and have a look at that one. But you'd want to have some good heating. When you get to my age, you want some good heating. But I suppose I'd have to, all right, it's bigger than a house, but Buckingham Palace, it would take me a month to explore all of the rooms in there, and everyone would have a fantastic story. So, yeah, I think Buckingham Palace.
I think that's a terrific choice. Shreya, what about you?
A whimsical question. Well, a few years ago, I stayed in a hotel in India that sort of, like, the conceit was that it used to be a palace, and it was very beautiful furnishings, very breezy, and it had these like swings that you could sort of lie on and relax. So I think I'd live there if I had to live anywhere.
I think that sounds wonderful. And finally, Tom, what about you? Any historic house for a month?
Mine's a little bit left field, but I've been a tour guide as a summer job at Althorpe House in Northamptonshire for the past 4 years now. It's built in 1508. It's a beautiful, homely English stately home to the Spencer family, but not my Spencer family. It's not too luxurious. I think I find somewhere like Versailles a bit intimidating to live in, whereas the Althorpe, I think, is down to earth, it's luxurious, it's beautiful, and I think everyone should come and visit and have a tour.
I think that was a wonderful advert for Althorpe there, Tom. So we'll now move on to the question and answer session. So if anybody has any questions, they can either put their hand up to ask their question, or they can type it in the chat. So has anybody got any questions for the panel? Oh, we've got one. Kaylee, if you would like to ask your question.
Hello, yes. Yeah, I just thought I'd basically ask sort of thing, I'd like sort of looking through sort of like a lot of the sites and sort of from you and sort of like the proposals sort of mentioned today, I did just actually wonder what would be the best way to actually achieve these reforms? Like, is this something that borough councils or town councils can approve themselves, or would this be something that has to come from Westminster?
Fantastic question. Who would like to have a crack at that question first? Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. You've got to remember there's always a big lump of politics get in the way of making important decisions, even though, you know, there's often the right decisions and then that should be made, but they get hampered by politics. And if you hand things into local authorities, unless they take a decision right at the beginning, I'm a past leader, I've led Monmouthshire County Council for 13 years, and unless you make a decision in the first year, you're unlikely, if it's controversial, you're unlikely to do it. So it really needs to be led, I think, from government.
Andrew, if you would like to give your response to that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, luckily Wales and Scotland, have devolved powers where they can address some of these issues, which is great. I think it does need to be done on a national scale, whether it be England, Wales, Scotland. But I also feel that the respect that needs to be paid to local government finance is really important. And I think it was mentioned earlier on by one of our speakers that getting that right is really key. So we've actually invested quite a lot of time thinking about how these taxes interact with local government finance to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same page. And if anyone's curious, I can drop that link into chat. But local government finance, if we're going to reform council tax, you have to deal with local government finance. And there's no way that we can fund social care and adult social care through council tax. It's absolutely absurd. Things need to change.
Great response. Anybody else who would like to come in on this first question?
I just quickly add that obviously council tax is controlled by central, like the local authorities have to move within the parameters set out by central government at the moment. So I don't think this is something that local governments could do on their own, but it certainly is something that like local and city region politicians could and have been calling for, like to be given more powers over property taxation. And levelling up obviously presents a political opportunity for changes in this space, as Andrew was saying, the funding of social care, and as does the issue of council tax bills going up and the cost of living crisis, and a policy which would see lots of people's council tax bills going down could be a political.
Yep, fantastic. I'll move on to our second question, which was sent in by Taylor. Taylor writes, whilst the Welsh Government has limited powers, how can it best use its existing powers to make purchasing a property easier? So who would like to go first with that? I think that would be probably best for Peter to answer that question first.
I don't know if I've got the answer. The Labour government won't listen too much to me as a backbencher, but I think that in fairness to the government, it really sees the importance of helping people get onto the property ladder, and that we need to find ways to help people do that through various schemes or help to buys or access to monies to help them offset deposits. I'm not sure what the exact answer is, but there are, at the end of the day, whilst Wales government has limited powers, it does have to hold the strings on its financial purse. All money that flows to it is unhypothecated. It can actually decide how it wants to drive the agenda. But I know they want to do things. I think the key thing they could do at the moment, though, is help more houses to be built. That's not happening. Some of the planning law at the moment is stopping houses to be being built in areas where they're needed, and trying to also try to socially engineer where houses are going to go. And so we've got to sort of look at all that as well.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to come in on Taylor's question at all?
I think I just want to jump in quickly. So I wanted to add that I think part of the solution in Wales comes down to reducing demand for houses as well. For example, that sounds really odd in the context, but essentially one issue that we have in Aberystwyth is that people are wanting to move house because, for example, houses are bad quality, or there's mold issues, or there's like big issues in houses that mean people can't live in them, they're uninhabitable. So this is a conversation that I had, for example, last year with Julie James, who at the time was the Minister for Housing. But essentially the conversation we had about it was, well, young people are stuck in Aberystwyth, at least, in houses that are bad quality. They can't use the landlord reporting system that we have in Wales, just due to its complexity, and they don't meet the criteria. Yet there are still houses that are inhabitable that basically fall in between the cracks. So people are effectively stuck in bad quality housing. So especially Aberystwyth being a seaside town, mold, for example, is a massive issue. Landlords don't keep up with upkeep, so people are wanting to buy their own houses and move into the private sector. So I think that one big issue is that other like methods can be used to fix current houses, which will reduce demand and then allow people to purchase more houses that are available. And also by just keeping up house upkeep, you'd help the market progress, because then more houses will be in good condition to sell. So it's kind of that double solution, where it's not only just about selling houses in the housing market, but rather also about kind of houses that we currently have and making sure that they're in a fit state to stay within the market.
That's a great response, Jazz. Anybody else want to come on to this question at all?
I was just going to say that I do think at the moment, given the limited powers that the Welsh government has, it's the land transaction tax is one of the only bits that is actually devolved. A lot of it also comes on the Welsh government calling on Westminster to implement a proportional property tax, and trying to work with them where obviously they do have devolved powers, because this isn't in this situation, it won't just be a sort of Westminster decides that, we're going to have a proportional property tax and then it's to get put in place. It will be having to work with devolved institutions and basically making sure that they're on side, because in a lot of cases, they do actually hold powers over what used to be stamp duty. So I do think that's an incredibly sort of important part of looking at devolution alongside plans like this, so that there is a clear plan in places like Wales to make sure that we factor in devolution to any plans.
Great response there, Torrin. I'll just come on to Reed's question. Reed sent a question in. The big concerns about proportional property tax seem to be it could force people out of homes they inherit. But if we make it easy to downside, does that not just nullify the issue, as people will still have somewhere to live, but without taking up a ridiculous amount of space they don't need? Now, Andrew, I know you wanted to come in on this question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, actually. I think if you're oiling the wheels, I guess, of buying property, then removing stamp duty will facilitate that. And if you end up inheriting, if you're fortunate enough to inherit a nice fancy house, but you don't need all that space and there's no stamp duty, then yes, it's much easier to downsize, pocket the difference. My personal belief actually is that inheritance tax is one of the fairest taxes, but I would actually do away with it. It doesn't generate a lot of revenue, about 5 billion a year. What I would do is, I think it's a very difficult situation we now have, which is where middle-class kids, end up relying on mum and dad to get on the property ladder. I think that's completely unfair for those from low and middle-income households who don't have that opportunity. But what I would love to do, and actually what we're doing, is we're repricing our fairer share. So just as a reminder, it's 0.48% of the property value, because property prices have gone up 15 to 20% over the last 2 or 3 years. We're obviously going to be able to enjoy it. Cuts, that 0.48% could go down. But what we could do is keep the 0.48% and keep the surplus to scrap inheritance tax, which would be great, because then that aligns with the idea of taxing the property over the lifetime of ownership, not at the beginning, not at the end. So yeah, great question.
Would anybody else like to offer an answer to Reed's question?
Yeah, I could quickly, sorry.
Yeah.
After you.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think this is one of the key concerns with the proportional property tax, alongside the issue of older people who've lived in a house for many, many years and where the house price has gone up a lot, but their tax bills haven't. And I think your question gets at the heart of the absurdity of the current system, because, yeah, you have people taking up lots of space that they don't need in a market where, there's so much pressure and demand for housing. Like either, something needs to give. Either they need to take up less space, or they need to be okay with more housing being built around them. But at the moment, they don't have any skin in the game, and neither of those things are happening. And so, yeah, something needs to move there, I think.
Tom, I know you wanted to come in on this question as well.
Yes, so the point I basically wanted to emphasise is that I think the fairer share model of proportional property tax, and this is all outlined in the local government finance paper, which Andrew has linked in the comments, does a really, really good job at basically nullifying all the worst effects that could come from this. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, any increases are capped at £1,200. So that's £100 a month more. We're already expecting council tax to rise dramatically in most places anyway, especially where I live in London. They're definitely going up by quite a considerable amount. So the increases which proportion of property tax factoring in aren't relatively that bad compared to the alternative that we're experiencing. And also, even if you are in a position where you're not able to afford that cost, and you can't pay it currently, the solution is you are prosecuted for not paying your taxes. And I think over 300 people went to prison in 2019 for not paying council tax. What proportional property tax proposes is you can defer your payment until you are able to get into a state where you are able to pay your fee. And that's a much fairer system that doesn't waste court's time. It doesn't unnecessarily prosecute people for simply not being able to afford their bills. And it just simply makes a better society in general, I think. So although, yes, some people will get into a position where they have to downsize, but the winners from that small loss are so much larger that this reform, which creates such massive benefits, I can't think of a reason anyone wouldn't support it.
I think it's a great response, Tom. We've got a question from Will Burrows. How can the Tories level up the country if they keep the unfair council tax system? Now, who would like to respond to that? Peter, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously in Wales. I'm not in control. Levelling up is absolutely fundamental to the Conservative Party, and I'm sure they're going to strive to deliver on that agenda wherever they can. Clearly, anything that holds back people from getting on in life or aspiring to things, anything which suppresses that aspiration, has to be dealt with. With not everything the Conservative Party might be doing in England is perhaps seen as heading in the right direction, but there is a lot of good work and a lot of commitment to level up the agenda. So there is a far more equal UK. However, like I say, I'm not an English politician. I can only reflect on things in Wales, really.
Of course. Andrew, I know you'd like to come in on this.
I mean, I think this is the nub of the issue, really, if I'm honest. I mean, I think that we could spend 2 hours discussing the politics of levelling up and what it means and will it actually happen and will the Tories, with all due respect, actually do it? I mean, I have to say I'm really disappointed with where we've got to. I think we've got a great campaign, a great policy, huge amount of support cross-party, but the amount of progress we've made with Michael Gove, Neil O'Brien in the levelling up team has been just absolutely woeful. They've briefed against us, they've campaigned against us, they haven't called us in for a detailed meeting on the impact. So very, very disappointing. And I think that they're going to do, with all due respect to the Conservative Party, the bare minimum to level up. It's going to be around town hall funds, it's going to be about allocation of infrastructure investment, but actually a tax cut for the low and middle income households up and down the country, whether they be in England, Wales or Scotland, is just not going to happen in a hurry. And I think that's tragic. And, I feel very disappointed that we're not going to be able to do the sort of reforms that would help. So we potter around the issue. We don't really address it. So I'm really disappointed. We actually have some really good polling figures that endorse and support the need for what we're campaigning for. It's politically great, but I feel why bother showing if they can't get to grips with the key issues of our reform? If they only want to get behind it because it helps them win an extra few seats in the red wall, then that's not, maybe I'm naive, but I think you've got to be doing policy reform for the right reasons, not just to get re-elected. So yeah, I don't want to put sort of downbeat sort of perspective on it, but I don't see the Tories genuinely levelling up, and I'm hoping, without upsetting some of our guests or one of our guest speakers, I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit more traction with the Labour front bench, who I think recognise there is a need for levelling up, and they're probably in a position to actually deliver it, hopefully.
Well, thank you for that response, Andrew. I'm aware that we're running a bit over time, so I think it will be time to wrap up now. Thank you for everyone who's come to the event, everyone who's taken part in the event. I think it's been a fantastic discussion on a very thorny but important issue. If anyone wants to get in touch or follow the work of the members of the panel, where should they go to find out more about each of you? Torrin, you first.
Having a slightly complicated name, it's fairly easy. It's just at Torrin Wilkins on pretty much any platform, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, pretty much same place for all of them.
Fantastic. Jazz, where can people find you if they want to follow you and your work?
Again, I have a very complicated name, so it's just at Jasneet Samrai on everything. Also, for me and Torrin, obviously we both work for Centre, so you can follow at Centre Think Tank for any research that we do as well.
Tom, where can people find you if they wish to follow your work and find out more about your work?
So the best place to find me is probably also on Twitter. My username is at TomJackSpencer. But if you're interested in engaging with most of the work I do, look at London New Libs on Twitter, because that's where you'll see most of my activity.
Peter, if people want to follow your work and see what you're getting up to, where should they go?
Well, you could find me on the Senedd website, but you'll find me on Twitter quite a lot at PeterFox61, and I think there's some other links there that people who know how to use things like Instagram have set up for me, but I don't go there much.
Shreya, if people want to find out more about your work, where should they go?
What a great question. I'll just put my Twitter link in the chat, and then you can also sign up to IPPR's newsletter to hear more about all our amazing works. I'll put that in the chat as well. Thanks.
Fantastic. And finally, last but not least, Andrew, where can people go to find out more about you and follow your work?
Yeah, I just added a couple of links to sort of highlight the great work that IPPR and WPI did on the work on Fairer Share. So that's there, and also just highlights the cross-party support. You can get a hold of me at andrew@fairershare.org.uk, but actually don't follow me. Follow Fairer Share. That's the best thing you could do. That would be really great if you can follow us, support us, mention us to your friends, family, email your MP. Get in touch with Peter and try and see if he can help us as well. But yeah, no, really appreciate your questions. Really great discussion. And yeah, thanks everyone at Centre.
Well, thank you once again, everyone who has come to the event, taken part in the panel event. It's been a great one. We'll be having some more panel events soon, so go to the Centre website to see when those events are announced. And thank you once again for coming, everyone. Hope to see you next time.